Okay. And is Al okay, or do you
Yeah,
prefer?
no, that's fine.
Okay. Al, it's very nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Thank you so much for being here. And so you are, is it DVM is a doctor of veterinary medicine?
Correct.
And a professor at the university.
Yes.
Okay. And how'd you get into that?
So a bit of a winding story, I guess. Well, like everybody else's sort of career paths. So when I came out after high school, like pretty much everybody didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself. Knew that I liked sciences. I like particularly health sciences, but really all sciences. But I also, was interested in law and politics and lots of other different areas. But did a basic undergraduate science degree here at the U of S. I was in my third year. I was doing biochemistry, really loved it, but I really liked physiology as well. And I was looking at, didn't know what to do with my life, but I thought maybe like physiotherapy, maybe optometry. Wasn't really too keen on dentistry and things like that in people's mouths, but I always had thought of veterinary medicine, and for the sort of reasons for people who don't understand the profession but think they like veterinary medicine because I like animals.
Right.
All right. Everybody likes animals, right? So you want to be a vet. So I spent some time with some veterinarians in my hometown of Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and it was a really good experience, but it was really eye-opening for a couple of different reasons, in that it wasn't so much the, hey, you're playing with animals, because that's not what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. You're looking after somebody's pet, traditionally, or when I was doing mixed animal work, looking at somebody's livestock or somebody's horses, things like that, but you're not playing with them, right? Like you would with your own pets. But what was fascinating for me was that the veterinarians were doing a wide range of activities, science-related activities. They were doing the diagnostics, they were doing the surgery, they were doing their own anesthesia. They basically had to do a little bit of everything. Whereas in human medicine, there's much less of that, right? Where things, well, let's do a blood test, well, it gets sent off to a lab, and they send you the results. Or you're going to go for surgery, well, somebody else does the anesthesia, another surgeon does the surgery, that kind of thing. Whereas in veterinary medicine, it was kind of doing a little bit of everything, and that really appealed to me. I thought that would be really interesting. But I didn't know if veterinary medicine was sort of the right kind of a fit for a career until I spent a whole summer volunteering at a local mixed animal practice in Yorkton. So I worked at the golf course in the mornings, and then went to the vet clinic in the afternoon. And that was a great experience. And I think I said, yeah, I think I'd like to do this. So after my third year of undergrad, I applied to vet school, and was lucky enough to be accepted. So I didn't complete my undergraduate degree at U of S, but then I did the 4-year vet degree, right, which was a wonderful experience. It's a really, really challenging program, but it was, great people, and just, you kind of felt like you had a home, right? You kind of felt like you had a path, and not, I was doing some stuff in the veterinary program that, okay, I'm not going to do when I graduate, working with chickens or working with maybe lab animals or things like that. But it was still really interesting, and I really enjoyed my time, but it was a pretty challenging program. After graduation, I was interested in a lot of different species, production animal medicine, particularly dairy, beef cattle, as well as small animals. Figured out pretty quick I wasn't really a horse person. I kind of like the horses, but it's a bit of a different world, and what the people who do it, like, you really, really got to be into it and really understand those type of people.
I heard one time horse people compared to, like, horse people are the equivalent of like car guys.
Yeah, and that's actually that's a good analogy, Nathan, in that they too, like, they're really, really expensive hobbies. Yeah, right? Horses are super expensive, cars are super expensive, and like, I'm kind of a car guy, and I understand that if you're going to be buying and selling, like, you're not doing it to try and make money, right? You're doing it because you love doing it, and you like. Well, it's the same thing with the horse people, right? Okay, if they're into that, you're putting a lot of money into these animals, but they obviously they love what they're doing. So I did work on some horses after I graduated, but it was, just kind of backyard stuff, never any, fancy thoroughbreds, big dollar horses, anything like that. So I had a job just north of Saskatoon in Rosthern for a couple of years, and really enjoyed that. But I also realized that while I liked business, I did not like human resources. And I didn't think it kind of freaked me out, the whole, and we had great people that I was working with at the clinic. That wasn't an issue at all. But owning a practice was probably something that would have been more stressful for me than I would have appreciated. And I think that's the same for a lot of, particularly medical professionals who get into it because they like the medical aspect of it, but don't really want to be business people. And, I don't think I didn't shy away from the business side of it, but the whole human resources side and, dealing with all of that with staff, I think was a little bit scary. The other thing was, I kind of was missing some of the science, really thinking about some of these topics rather than kind of day to day, seeing the cases, which were really, really rewarding on sort of a day to day basis, but kind of long term getting a sense that maybe I'm not utilizing some of the skills that I'd like to utilize. And so I decided that I was going to go back to the university, and I was really interested in pharmacology as a student. I don't know why, because all my other classmates, they hated it. They thought it was like one of those subjects you just kind of had to get through. So drugs, how they work, that sort of thing. But I'd always liked physiology and, physiology, how the body works. And for me, the pharmacology was just like applied physiology. Like, okay, there's something wrong with how this cell is working or how this organ is working. So we're going to use a drug and it acts on this receptor and it does this and it's going to change the physiology. And I thought that was really neat, which is a bit different. Like most of my classmates, they weren't too excited about that. They liked surgery, right? And they thought, okay, well, surgery's cool. Like surgery is just applied anatomy. So something's wrong, something's broken. You got to go in, you got to fix it, you got to do whatever. You're recreating the anatomy. I hated anatomy as a student. I was terrible at it. I wasn't a horrible surgeon, but I knew I wasn't a great surgeon either. I was never going to be.
Okay.
But I liked the drugs. And so I came back and I started a graduate studies program, a Master of Science, and a residency program. So like a specialized training program in clinical pharmacology. So yeah, that was 2 years in private practice, and then 2.5 years doing the residency program. And then after that, I honestly, Nathan, I had no idea what I was going to do. I could just get that far, right? Do one step at a time. So I did that, and I thought naively, I kind of figured that, some drug company will come and
work itself out.
And people are always like, oh man, the drug companies, they got so much money, and, they're going to dig all the swag, right? And, you make big bucks and you have this, nice lifestyle and whatever. I was like, this was 2007, and it was just before the financial crisis in 2008. And you could kind of tell the writing was on the wall that like, no, the companies aren't hiring. And even if they were, like, it wasn't necessarily something I thought I might be super interested in.
Sorry, and this was to work as a drug rep?
Well, kind of like, or to be involved in, say, the technical services side for the drug company, or really what I would be interested in would be the trials, the clinical trials, or the preclinical trials for the drug design. And I just sort of, again, this was really naive. I really hadn't done my homework on this when I started this pharmacology program and really thought about where this would go. And to be fair, I probably could have pursued it and went that way, but it was 2007. I had just finished my master's degree, written my thesis, completed my board exams and passed those. I'd gotten married that year. I still had a bunch of unfinished business relating to my graduate program. So I still had papers that I needed to get written and get accepted for publication, and just lots of like loose ends. So at the time, my department at the university, at college, had hired somebody to fill in for another faculty member who had retired. And that faculty member had been teaching tons and tons of courses. And because the new person to fill, who was going to get that position, they were doing a postdoctorate position and they couldn't come for another year. So they had this massive gap in teaching load that hadn't been picked up. And so the department was looking for somebody to fill in for a year and just to do this teaching load. And I honestly, I was like, I want to get all this stuff off my plate. It's just for 1 year. I was kind of interested to see, well, I don't know if I would actually like teaching or not. I'd never really thought about like a professor or like kind of an academic career, but let's see if I like it. I liked, as a graduate student, I've been involved in labs with veterinary students and animal science students, and I really liked it. I liked the interaction, and I thought I might be okay at this. So I said, okay, well, I'll apply for this, see if I'll try it for a year. So I did, and that's kind of how the ball started rolling, and that was in, I guess, August of 2007. And yeah, it's been a variety of different teaching positions ever since then.
Wow. So yeah, that's interesting that it just kind of like it fell in front of you and then you've been rolling with it. I think that happens a lot with people. They find something that they really enjoy that way just by almost mistake.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think for a lot of the people who get into, particularly for academia and teaching, the ones who really want an academic position are, in my experience, often ones who it's because of the research angle. That's why they want it. And they think, okay, well, I need a professor job so I can do my research. Whereas the ones who really find that they like to teach, I don't know how other people get, I mean, maybe even your other podcast guests, you find out, how these people get into these positions. For me, it was just it was a one-off thing for 1 year, do it, get all those loose ends tied up. And I did it, and I found, I kind of got a sense when I was doing this, I'm like, I think I know what I'm doing here. I think I can relate to the students. I had graduated from the DVM program, I guess, 4.5 years before that. So I was still pretty fresh in this. I think I knew them pretty well. I was kind of the same age cohort. And I think I know what they gripe about because I know what I griped about, right? As a student, like, oh, damn, these professors, and they don't, their notes are all a mess, and nothing isn't it's all unorganized, and they're talking about a bunch of useless stuff, and it's not interesting, and all of these things. I'm like, okay, if I was going to do it, I'm going to make it more interesting, right? I'm going to actually make it organized so the students know what they have to focus on, like stuff like that. And yeah, so I started that first year, and I kind of realized, this is I actually really like doing this. The problem was it was a 1 year position. And so that's what led to a whole series of contracts year after year that I was doing for the university. But it was kind of by my choice. I had, after that 1 year job, that was full time. And it was totally a full-time job because I had to make all of these classes from scratch. So all the lecture material for, for a bunch of different classes. Because the other prof who had retired, he gave me all of his notes and things, but it was like, this was old school. So like not always PowerPoints, right? You're talking about like overheads and, awesome. like definitely old school stuff. Yeah. But it was really good. There was a framework there. So at least I kind of knew in terms of the material. But yeah, I had to design all this from scratch. So it was a ton of work. And then I realized the university, they weren't going to pay me full time to do this. But it was I felt like there was a real missed opportunity there to just do it for a year because I did it. I thought I did a good job, but I knew I could do it better still. Right now, that I had a little experience under my belt, particularly when it came to like doing labs with the students. So like in the laboratory, and the first time around, I kind of knew what was going on, but I really wasn't as confident. I said, if I got a chance to do this again, I could do it a lot better. And it would be so much more efficient because I've done it the first time. So I had talked to the dean of the vet college at the time and said, look, would it be possible to do this kind of teaching position? But, I realize you guys can't pay me full time to do this, but could I do it part time? Because I think, it would only take me half as much time to do all this. Yeah. And they thought about it for a bit and said, yeah, actually that makes sense. I thought it would be good value for them. But they said, well, what are you going to do with your other rest of your time? And said, well, don't worry about it. I'll figure something out. And while I was in my residency program, I'd gone to a conference and I had met some folks from Health Canada. So for listeners, Health Canada is involved in approving drugs in Canada. Right. Okay. So human drugs, but I, as a veterinarian and doing vet drugs, they were interested in the vet drug side, and they needed somebody specifically who looks at drug residues. In food animals. So this is kind of an esoteric topic, but it's when drugs get used in animals that either produce food or are going to get slaughtered and eaten, then those drugs can leave tiny little bits of residues in their tissues, and it's really, really safe. That's the most overarching message. But there's a process that it goes through to make sure that it's safe. So the concentrations of these drugs are like super tiny. and things that would be unsafe don't get approved. They don't get used. But it's a really niche area. There's not a lot of people that kind of do this work, but that's what I had done in my graduate studies program. That's what my project was about. So Health Canada was looking to potentially bring me on board. I wasn't interested in moving to Ottawa at the time, and I wasn't interested in full-time doing work for regulatory kind of stuff. But then I called them up after that first year at the university, and I said, hey, would you guys be interested if I worked for you part-time? And I did it out of Saskatoon, and I thought they were going to, tell me to go away. Like, really, who are you to tell us how, you're going to do the job? But thankfully, they were pretty open-minded about it, and they said, well, let's try it. So like the university had done, they gave me a contract for 6 months, half-time. They gave me some projects to do relating to this area that were pretty scientifically kind of high level stuff. You kind of had to really dig in and sort of demonstrate that I had some competence in this area. So I did that, and they were like, yeah, it worked out pretty good. You did the job, you did it on time, your writing skills were decent. So I said, okay, well, they'll continue to hire me part-time. So for the next, from 2008 to 2018, I did teaching at the university part-time and working for Health Canada part-time. Wow. So in a series of contracts. And it was great in that both of those jobs, I got the good aspects of the jobs. I mean, the teaching, I just got to teach students. I did a little bit of research with other faculty members, like helping out their students and things like that. But I didn't have my own research program. And at the time, I was okay with that. And I didn't have to do all the administrative nonsense that you have to do at a university job. And then for Health Canada, it was the same deal. I got to do the work. I didn't have to deal with like the internal politics, and I didn't have to deal with a bunch of the nonsense that was involved with any kind of like working in an office, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that was a really good deal, and I was pretty happy with that for quite a while. Those two positions required some juggling between them. But yeah, then in 2018, I kind of, I'd like to really get back into doing the research, and an opportunity came up to go for a tenure track position. So like a real faculty job. So I got that at the university, same department, same everything. Yeah. My teaching load changed a fair bit, some of the courses that I taught, but so yeah, I've been doing that and developing a research program for the last 5 years. So COVID's been a bit of a challenge, like it for everybody, but and I still keep in touch. I still will do consulting work with Health Canada, help them out with some of the stuff that I used to help them with, just a little bit, not quite as much now, and just kind of where they need me. So yeah, so that's kind of whirlwind of the last, oh my God, I'm getting so old, Nathan. 16 years since I finished my residency, and 20 years since I finished my my DVM program.
Oh. There's that experience has to be so helpful now, though, just with making sure that I imagine like everything is just much more smooth for you now, just knowing how to go about things. And
well, yes and no. I mean, for the teaching part of it, for sure, because I'd been doing this for a long time before I kind of got the tenure track job. So I was aware of the process, right, and dealing with the students and exams and all that kind of stuff that some say newer faculty haven't really done before. I'd been doing it for years and years, and at a pretty heavy teaching load. The research world was, I was aware of it because I had seen, of course, all my colleagues in the department and in the university, and they're always complaining about this and writing grants and all the bureaucracy and all that stuff. Well, it's one thing to see it; it's another thing to live through it. So
yeah,
that was a bit of a definitely an eye opener in some respects. Trying to find a grad student and getting summer students and training people up and things like that. But it's been great. Yeah, I've been really, really appreciating that. But still, the highlight of the job is still the teaching. Yeah. Like the research is nice. I really enjoy it. And it's kind of what gets you going in that it's new and you're excited by it. But really, it's the teaching. Without that, the job wouldn't be what it is.
Is there anything specific about the teaching that's so great?
Well, for me, and then this is, I got to be careful when I say this, not careful, but it's in the vet college, our students, it's a really tough program to get into. And the students that, once they're there, it's a really tough program to get through. So our students are super motivated. And it's a bit of a different experience. Maybe some for your other guests, if they're teaching, say, younger university students, or say in like high school or junior high or elementary school, and you're teaching a broader kind of a cohort where you got some stronger students, maybe some students that are weaker that need extra help. Well, I'm teaching kind of the cream of the crop. It makes my job super easy in that respect. In that, the challenges that I face are that they want more information, that they want to know all of this extra stuff. And I'm like, well, guys, that you guys don't, that's great. I'm super excited that you want to know that. But in terms of this course material, like there's only so much that you can be expected to learn. And that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about. Yeah. And, everybody's brain's got limited capacity here, right? And, you can't fill it up with everything. Yeah. But it's a good problem to have, that the students want, more information, more time, more instruction. They're not skipping out. They're not, they want to be there, and it shows. So that's the part, I think, for me that's really exciting. The other thing is, first and foremost, people ask, well, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a veterinarian. I could say I'm a professor. I work for Health Canada. I could say I'm a bureaucrat. I could say I'm a pharmacologist, because that's my area of specialty. But first, I'm a veterinarian. And, it's a real honor, but a responsibility that, like, well, I'm helping to train this next generation in my profession. And I think all of us in the vet college, we take that seriously. Like, you don't mail it in, right? These people are going to be our colleagues when they graduate, and they're the future of our profession. So kind of the onus is on me. I got to make sure that I'm doing as good a job as I possibly can training them up. But it's also really fun and exciting. And they're just a good group of students. So that's the part of it that's, it's definitely the highlight of the job.
It's so much fun to be surrounded by people like that too. Like, just when you have that like-mindedness, in the sense that just like everyone's like-minded in their drive. They all want to just learn and learn and learn. But then you're also getting that there's discussions, and people are contradicting each other much more, just because everybody wants to get that knowledge and that learning. And so I think I've been in a few spaces like that, and it's so much fun because you just get so much more valuable insight.
Yeah, and I should preface that by saying, not every student, like I said, my classmates didn't really like pharmacology, taking it as a subject. Not every student is like super excited about this particular course, but they still want to be there. They still want to be in the program. And yeah, when you do get those discussions, it's humbling, but it's also really motivating at the same time. And like, they ask a question, and I'm like, wow, I had never thought of that. Like, I've been teaching this same course now, 5 years, 10 years, whatever there. I'm like, I had never considered that particular angle. Like, that is a really unique way of looking at it. And it may turn out to be totally invalid, what they're hypothesizing, but it's still, it's so exciting when you see the students that they're actually processing the information and then taking it to another level. Maybe it's totally off track, but they're actually thinking about it, which is, really what we want them to be doing, is not just understanding the material, but then applying it and broadening the scope and the application of it.
Well, that's where the true learning comes from too, right? Is when you can take a concept and you have this understanding of it that's not just rote anymore. Like, you can actually like manipulate it in your mind and see it from different angles.
Well, and we just was at a conference last month, a veterinary pharmacology specific conference, and for a lot of us involved in the teaching world, and we were just discussing that. And it's a very different syllabus and curriculum depending on which vet school you're in, and amount of contact time they get to learn this material. And that's sort of the typical debate is, well, how much time do you spend on content, and how much time do you spend on like application of this? And I find it's a real balancing act. And we all say that, okay, well, it's about the application. You got to know how to use these facts, right? It's not about rote memorization. Like, nobody cares about that. You can look it up, right? Everybody just Googles it. Like, tell the students, there's an application on their phone. It's got all the drugs approved for animals in Canada. You just go, if you need to find a dose or you need to find something, you just go on there and you find it, right? You got to use the tools that are there. So it's about applying it, right? How do you do it? But the flip side of it is, and I've seen this unfortunately, is when you just jump to the application without any of the basic structural content there, it's so overwhelming for the students because they have no idea, especially with drugs, because they all have weird names that nobody, you know, it's like watching the, you know, TV or something, and you see like these ads come up for something you've never heard of before, right? And you're like, what the hell is that? And you're like, well, guess what? You're going to learn that and a whole bunch of other ones too. So you got to know at least a little something about the content, but not everything, right? You don't need to memorize it. You just have to have the basics there. And then we can get into the application, which for me was the really cool part, right? Is how are you actually going to use this? What sort of things are you going to get into trouble with? You know, you combine this drug, and that's really bad news. Those are the things that really want to focus on. But I've made that mistake where you kind of cut back a little bit too much on the pure content, and then the students get really frustrated because they don't, you can't apply something if you don't have those basics to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. Yeah. So that's really interesting too, and especially with the combination piece you mentioned about like what drugs can use together. Because I believe in human medicine, if I'm understanding correctly, the doctor prescribes this stuff, and then the pharmacist checks that part, right? They go over the prescription list to make sure that everything can be used together. But you guys have to know it all yourselves. Is that correct? Yeah,
so we should have an idea of what you, as the veterinarian, you need to sort of understand what you're prescribing, and will there be any kind of interactions by putting those things together. It certainly is potentially an issue. I don't think it's not the same as in human medicine though, where you're right, where the MD prescribes it, at least historically, and then the pharmacist fills the prescription. Often it's the pharmacist that says, well, wait a minute, you know, you're on this beta blocker and this other cardiac drug, and we'll better watch out. You know, there's a potential interaction there. My sister's a pharmacist, so I better give them a plug. You know, but in veterinary medicine, it's a little bit. It's certainly theoretically an issue. It's a little bit less likely of a problem in actuality. One of the reasons why is because most animals, even pets, dogs and cats, are not getting a whole bunch of drugs at the same time, like in human medicine. Yeah. Particularly, think of like, you know, geriatric medicine or the elderly can easily be on, you know, half dozen, 8-10 drugs at a time, like every day, right? You got the pill vial with like all the different pills for every day. Well, with animals, you know, there are some medications that we'll use, say, daily or every other day, but there's not going to be a lot of them at the same time. So the odds of getting an interaction between the drugs are generally fairly low. It certainly can happen if, you know, a couple different things are prescribed. But again, in veterinary medicine too, you're probably not going like, oh, I've got this drug from this pharmacy and this drug from this doctor, you know, a prescription, and you're pretty much getting them from the same veterinarian. Right. So they kind of should have an idea of what that animal is getting.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. That it's just obvious, I guess. But yeah, just that your pets aren't typically going to be on as many medications as your parents. So
yeah, no, it is rule of thumb, and it's you know, when we think about like paying for all of those medications for your pet too, it's like all of a sudden you start to do a triage in your mind, right? Like which ones are the most, really, are these ones critical? Yeah. And you know, there's a lot of people that do a lot of like supplements and things like that, and certainly in some instances that maybe could have an impact on some of these drugs, but for the most part it's all pretty innocuous. So it's definitely an issue as veterinarians that, you know, you kind of need to be aware of, but it's not the same level of risk as in human medicine where there's just so much more drug usage.
Do people give their pets supplements?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's all kinds of them, and it's just like in the human world, it's exactly the same thing. Where there's some supplements that are extremely high quality, lots of evidence behind them, good quality studies, data, and other ones it's like, man, you have no idea where this is coming from. Same thing in the vet world. So a lot of times clients, you know, they'll talk to the veterinarian. Say, you know, an animal might be arthritic and they want, say, something like glucosamine for their joints, and well, there's a whole ton of different products that you could go out and get. And, you know, so for people ask, well, what should I get? Like, well, you know, you talk to your veterinarian, see what they're recommending on these things. But generally, like most things, it's a bit of a, you know, you get what you pay for deal. And the bigger products are typically a little bit more evidence behind them, a little bit more quality control for nutraceuticals. But that doesn't always, there's sometimes some small products that are actually quite good quality, and there's other times there's some big name products that are like, wow, this absolutely does no good. And it's totally hit and miss, but it's totally the same in the human world too.
Yeah. So true. It's funny that you bring up glucosamine actually, because we had a we had a dog that we were giving glucosamine. I guess is it effective? Like, is it something worth?
So that's a bit of a debate. My take on this, again, this is not, I'd have to look at the recent evidence to give you more informed opinion on it, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Not at all. Is it something that would be recommended? Probably. I think it has a role to play when you're talking about joint disease and degeneration in the joints. The problem, what I found, is that for a lot of pet owners, they start administering it after the dog is already arthritic. And at that point in time, it's kind of late. It's kind of late to because basically it's preventing joint degradation, and sort of keeping that cartilage as happy as it can be. But after you've already started to get some of those changes in the bones and in the joints, it's probably not going to do anything about pain and working as an analgesic. That's not really what it does. But does it have a role to play in maybe slowing down progression? Certainly, there's some evidence to show this. The problem with any of these studies is, it's easy to kind of show some stuff in a petri dish, right? Like in vitro sort of things. In large scale clinical trials, it's been hit and miss. The other thing we mentioned, like with the different products, some of them are really, really high quality. You get a good study, it shows that it works, but then you use a different type of product and, no effect whatsoever.
Yeah.
Well, is it that the actual, glucosamine doesn't work, or is that specific product didn't work? So it's really messy to try to come up with a clear-cut answer on things like that. But again, it doesn't really do any harm, and it's not particularly expensive. So for, even my buddies are asking, well, hey, I've got a dog and worried about arthritis. Should I have my glucosamine? Yeah, definitely not a bad idea. But keep your expectations in check. Like, it's not going to work any miracles here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also marketed to humans, I believe. Too.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, and there's a lot of times, a lot of veterinarians will actually just tell their clients, like we're not going to stock this kind of stuff. Just go to wherever you get your nutraceuticals from, and you get some whatever brand that they like to use, like one of the big name brands. There are some issues with animals versus things for people in terms of how they're formulated and like how well they get absorbed from the intestines and things like that. Certainly can be an issue in some cases. In other cases, it's totally overblown. But yeah, it's same issues between the animals and the people. There's so many similarities. There's some pretty big differences too, of course, but there's a ton of similarities there.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I also saw that you did some research in it was the composition of cannabinoid products marketed to pet owners too.
Yeah, so this was a weird one. I never ever million years dreamed I was going to be doing research on cannabis stuff. This is not. So what happened on this one, Nathan, was that in 2018, Canada approved cannabis. So they legalized it, right?
Yeah.
So historically, there had been medical cannabis available for quite some time in Canada, but in 2018 they just said, okay, no, it's legalized. Period. And as somebody who worked in, in Health Canada, not in that area, but kind of understood sort of the regulatory process, I could feel the pain for my compatriots that still worked in Health Canada, because they were told by the government, okay, just legalize it. Like, that's not how this works, right? Like, this is a multi-year deal where you actually have to go through it and like come up with, you have to do all these like stakeholder relations, and you got to get feedback from all the people who are going to be impacted by it, and you got to have your plan of how you're going to implement this. And it was basically like, here you go, end of the year, legalize it, get it done. So at least it got done. I guess that was the good news, is that they did it, but it was pretty messy. So one of the things when they drafted the legislation for this, for the veterinary side, people just said, oh, well, okay, it's no big deal. You use cannabis in our animals now. And the way the legislation was worded, it says, I can't remember the specifics, but it says something that it use the term persons instead of patients, certainly on the medical side. And you say, well, it's just semantics, right? It doesn't matter. But the interpretation of that, unfortunately for veterinarians, what it meant was, because it said persons, that excluded animals. If it would have said patients, then they're like, okay, this kind of means any sort of medical type of, practitioner-patient relationship, which include veterinarians and their patients. But it didn't say that. So in Canada, all the veterinary licensing bodies have said, no, cannabis isn't legal for veterinarians to prescribe.
Okay.
Okay, so veterinarians aren't giving it out. That being said, we know our clients have been using some of these cannabis products, and specifically, we said it's been cannabidiol, CBD,
Right.
is the one. Like, as veterinarians, we've long had cases of cannabis toxicosis, right? So, the classic example is, the dog goes and it gets into somebody's stash, right? And it goes and it eats the brownies or whatever it is. And the dogs get intoxicated, and cats rarely, but it can happen to them too. And then, they're, for lack of a better term, they're high for a period of time, and there's no specific antidote or anything like that. The animals, as long as it's not like a super severe case, they recover uneventfully after a couple of days. So that, as a veterinarian, like, that was our experience with cannabis and marijuana, was intoxication, like, not therapeutic uses. And all of a sudden, we've had a whole bunch of clients come and say, hey, we want to use these cannabinoids, CBD, but we want to use it therapeutically. So the biggest kind of market for that, or usage for that potentially, would be things like arthritis. Because there's, dogs get old, cats get old, they get arthritic, and, maybe this will help.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of other potential uses as well. Dogs and cats can be epileptic, just like people, so they have seizures. And in the human world, I have a colleague at Royal University Hospital who's been looking at this CBD oil for kids with epilepsy, and showing some good results with that. And others in the U.S., in Colorado State in particular, and other institutions looking at using cannabinoids for animals and people with epilepsy. And that really does, if there's an avenue where this is going to work, that seems to be the one. But other potential usages as well, either to make animals less nauseous or to stop them from vomiting.
Right.
Different types of inflammatory conditions where maybe the CBD can be an anti-inflammatory. So anyway, all kinds of different potential usages, and people would ask us about it, and then they'd ask me as a pharmacologist, I don't know, man, I never did cannabis stuff. Like, I don't know, this isn't a legal drug, right?
Yeah.
When we go through, like, I don't know if it works or not, but there was a ton of interest in it. And because it was legalized in Canada, we could, legally do this research. So I thought, I didn't realize how many hoops I'd have to jump through to do these studies. Which I
Just because it was on animals, right?
Well, I mean, both, because it was on animals, but particularly because it was cannabis related research. And so the whole regulatory paradigm hadn't been fully fleshed out yet. And so it was a work in progress. And so all the people doing cannabis work in humans are the same problems that I encountered as well.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I wrote a grant for this because there seemed to be money in this area. That's one thing I again talk about, like, as a researcher, I didn't know this kind of stuff. Like, I didn't, like, okay, you start a research program, right? Yeah, I guess you got to get some money somewhere, but like, well, you got to go where there's actually money to be had.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a grant to the Morris Animal Foundation in the United States. And they were interested in this and said, sure, we'd like to fund some work on this. Well, it turned out there was at least a few more years of work involved before I could actually start the project, because we had to demonstrate the safety of this particular formulation. And so that was a whole nother deal for a couple of years to generate this data. But for your original question of, well, the formulation of these products, so we were doing some very early studies with some of our teaching dogs that we have in the vet college. So we have a number of animals. Now they're beagles. They've been some different breeds. And we use them for some of the labs with the students. We're doing things like, physical exams, practicing. And then for non-invasive, small-scale research projects, these animals can be used as well. So it's pretty cool. These animals, they have a really nice life at the vet college.
That's good.
They get
Yeah.
lots of attention. Lots of varied kind of usages, and of course lots of other animals for them to hang out with. And so we had done some work in 2019. Hadn't ever used any cannabis products, CBD products before in these animals, but I got the approvals to do that. And we found some interesting things. We were just measuring blood levels, but we were hearing these stories about, people buying stuff from pet stores.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking in the back of my mind, Nathan, I'm like, why the hell am I going through all this work trying to get all these approvals, right? and jumping through all the hoops with Health Canada. I'm like, people are just buying it from the pet stores.
Yeah.
So let's go. The difference was, we were doing everything above board, and we were using products that were, regular, totally approved for use.
Yeah.
So we said, well, what are they actually selling at the pet stores? So I sent my summer student at the time And so she went out to pet stores, and she went actually out to some of the pot stores, which in 2019, right, they had just started, right? And they had opened up. There were not nearly as many as there are now. And she went out there, and thankfully, when she went to the pot stores, every one of them had said, no, we're not touching this. We don't have any recommendations for animals. We don't do anything with animals. That's you talk to your veterinarian about that, which was totally what they should be saying. So that was great to hear. It wasn't like they were like, oh yeah, here's a bunch of gummies for your dog or something, right? Like, no. The pet stores, on the other hand, there were a few in town that were selling some of these products. And what we wanted to do is, like, what is this stuff? Like, what's in it? As part of our other study with our beagles, we had been measuring blood levels of the cannabinoids, CBD and THC primarily, in their blood after we had given them an oral dose. So to do that, you have to develop this assay to actually measure all this kind of stuff. So we've got this analytical techniques available. So can we actually measure what's in these products? And they were all like oil-based products, which is kind of a standard way for animals to administer cannabinoids. So my summer student went out and she bought a bunch of these different products from. There were only a couple pet stores at the time that were selling them, and they were not cheap, and they all had really, really interesting names. And when we analyzed them and found that some of them were, well, it was a bit of a mess, because like some of them were actually pretty close to what they said they had in them, which is good to see. They would never pass muster as like a drug, like a pharmaceutical drug, but they weren't horrible. Other ones, like, they had nothing there. And ironically, it was the ones that were really expensive that had nothing. So there goes my theory of you get what you pay for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it was interesting. And then we didn't know this, but at the time, some folks in Ontario were doing pretty much exactly the same thing.
Okay.
And so we got together and we said, well, let's combine this. Now, we had used different methodologies to measure the stuff, and we had looked at different products and things. So it wasn't totally apples and apples, but it was still worth putting together. And so we had published that in the Canadian Vet Journal and said, hey, look, just, different types of products that are out there. And the key take-home message for veterinarians and for consumers on that one was, these products, like, you don't really know what you're getting. And we didn't have a big enough sample size to, what I really would have liked to do is measure multiple batches of the same products, see how consistent they are. We basically just had one-offs from each particular batch. Right. So we couldn't draw like big conclusions about it, but there were enough products and there was enough discrepancy between them that you could, caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware on this. And so for people who are interested in getting some of these cannabis products, like, you got to make sure you know exactly what's in it, and that, because a lot of the products they didn't have in it what they said they had in it.
That's so interesting. Oh.
And the bigger issue for me as a pharmacologist was like, well, what dose do you give? Like, how are you supposed to administer this? And there was like no directions on the product, or they'd be like, well, put a couple drops in their food, which is essentially like homeopathy, right? Like, it's like, no, like the doses that might actually do something would have been 100-fold higher than that, right? You're giving like a few milliliters of, in some cases, like tens of milliliters of oil as a dose, not a couple of drops. And they sort of say, well, why might you use this? And they were sort of very vague in like what the claim for this product would be. So
was that because of the legality of?
I think that's it. I think that was good. It was kind of like a gray market thing. Yeah. It's a little bit like with and I don't want to conflate the issues here, but a little bit like with the nutraceuticals, right? Like the herbal products, in that they're not allowed to make the same types of claims as a pharmaceutical. So a pharmaceutical product says, for treating this condition, and typically it would be like treating the specific symptom of that condition, right? So let's say you got high blood pressure, for lowering your blood pressure, right? Something that's very testable. A lot of the nutraceutical products would be like as an aid in cardiovascular health. Something kind of vague and generic. Now, it doesn't mean they don't work, and it doesn't mean they're not helpful, but they need to meet a much higher burden of proof to be able to say, yes, we're going to be able to do this.
And nutraceuticals have a higher burden of proof?
Well, no, a drug has a much higher burden of proof than a nutraceutical.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and it's not that a nutraceutical can't do it, but they just need to do the studies and then get the evidence and get it evaluated. And, and then the way that they're handled in terms of the manufacturing and the chemistry and the quality control, just a whole nother level as a pharmaceutical, like, which is why a lot of the small scale companies, they're happy to get into the market because they can do that, but they could never rise to the level of a pharmaceutical because they just can't meet those standards.
Right.
Well, it's the same deal with the cannabis stuff. But the people that we were doing our research with, this was medical grade. It's the same product that those kids with epilepsy at Royal University Hospital, same product that they're getting.
Okay.
People ask, well, how did you choose? Like, there's a million different cannabis products. How did you choose which one to study? I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I'm like, it was like we knew these folks, some of our colleagues, they were using it and they were seeing really good results with it, and it was safe in the kids with epilepsy. Yeah. So and the company was interested. So I'm like, okay, let's we'll try that. But yeah, the cannabis products, it was a bit of an eye opener, although I guess not that surprising that they were kind of all over the map.
Yeah.
And it's been found, Nathan, in other parts of the world too. With a lot of, anytime there's a market for it, right? People want to jump in, and I had calls when I first got into this. People found out you're doing cannabis. I'm not making this up. They're growing cannabis plants in their backyard, and they want to do studies because they love animals, and they want to do studies on this. Like, hey, could we collaborate and do a study? And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you, man. I'm like, I've been doing 3 years of dealing with Health Canada, getting these approvals. Like, no, I'm sorry, we can't just
do a study in my backyard.
That's pretty much like, yeah. But I appreciate the passion. Yeah. Like, I like the fact that they're interested in it. But it's like, for a lot of the general population, they just don't understand the level of rigor involved in some of these scientific studies.
Yeah.
So,
well, and some things get like, lots of things get really cult-like followings. And cannabis tends to be one of those things too. Like, some of the people that are like really into it are like, think it's just what's it called? I can't remember. There's a word for like the medicine that people think will just cure anything if you take it. I can't remember.
Well, I can say this. I mean, I know when I got, and I was Nathan. This is why I was a little bit leery getting into this world, because I knew, and it's not just like animal owners. There were some veterinarians that I would categorize as like true believers, right? That were totally into this. Now, there were some veterinarians in particular, and certainly medical doctors too, who were like, no, this is all snake oil, right? It's just a placebo, and and whatever, it's not doing anything, and scientifically it's all going to be debunked. And I'm skeptical, still am skeptical, but I was like, I'm hopeful too. Like, geez, I hope this stuff actually works for what we want to use it for. It'd be nice. But by no means was I a true believer. And it was so kind of an anecdote on this one. This is what I talk to our students, and I say, as veterinarians, you have to communicate with a lot of people, right? People with very different viewpoints, very different levels of, of scientific understanding or familiarity with animals, all this kind of stuff. And you got to be able to switch gears really quickly. You're talking to a colleague, maybe referring a case, and, a very detailed medical jargon, to talking to the general public, right? Speaking to kids. You got to be able to switch on a dime. And I know that from personal experience. With this cannabis stuff and the true believers, the University of Saskatchewan put on a cannabinoid conference in 2019. It was right in the middle when we were doing our studies in the dogs.
Okay.
So we had catheters in the dogs, and we had just dosed them. We were taking blood samples, and then there was a 2-hour break in between the dosing before we had to go take between one blood sample to the next blood sample.
Okay.
So I had this 2-hour window. And this cannabis conference was going on, and they had asked me to come and present some of our study, what we're doing and what we're looking for, and because it was mostly geared from the human side, but they said, hey, veterinary medicine might be using cannabinoids too. So I run over from the vet college it was in Marquis Hall or something on campus, right? Run across the bowl and get in there, and I rip my lab coat off and have presentable clothes on and get in there. And do this little 20-minute talk on exactly what we're doing, and have some nice pictures of our dogs with catheters in and stuff. And after the talk, I'm speaking with some of the attendees at the conference, and there was the now Dean of Pharmacy and Nutrition. There was one of the preeminent pediatric neurologists from Colorado, who was one of the first to use cannabis in kids with epilepsy, who was brought up to speak, who, by the way, he came into the vet college and watched us do our study and was fascinated by the work we were doing. And I thought it was so low level, shoestring, running around. It's not fancy. It's not any high level research, but he just thought it was fantastic, right? That we were in there, and he said, the camaraderie and the team aspect that we had, he really appreciated that. And the fact that it was very much like ground level research. But and then there was some other folks there. I remember some Dalhousie University metabolism experts and analytical chemists, and so I got sucked into this conversation with 3 individuals, and I'm doing this research, but I am by no means an expert in any of these things, Nathan.
Yeah,
I am struggling to hang on to this conversation, right? You know, we're in a conversation with somebody like at a really, really high level, right? And you're like, I'm just trying to not look stupid, right? And not see, and they're all really interested in the work that we're doing, and they're asking about the different metabolic pathways in dogs and how we think they're going to compare to the metabolic pathways in humans for detoxifying cannabis, and what sort of liver enzymes, and we're going to use which family of cytochrome oxidase enzymes. And like, oh man, I'm really struggling to stay with this, right? Yeah. So I'm like, okay, guys, check my watch. Got to run. Got to go take the blood sample from the next dog. I'm like, wow, I got out of that one.
Yeah,
that was tough. I was sweating. Go down into the bowl. Well, 2 of the attendees at the conference. Have you ever seen them? Probably before your time. Have you ever seen the movie Dazed and Confused?
I haven't actually watched, but I know.
You know what I'm talking about? So the stereotypical like stoner potheads, right, from the 1970s. And there were 2 girls that just came straight out of that movie. And they had been attending this conference because they were interested in cannabinoids, right? And like, honest to God, and I'm not making this up, the one girl had like the Rastafarian hat on and everything. She's like, "Whoa, dude, loved your talk, man." And I'm like, "Oh, that's great, thanks." And she's like, "Yeah, man, like, so like, is it a problem if we like give cannabis to our pets?" I'm like, well, yeah, generally, like, we know that's not what we're recommending. Right?
Yeah.
We're trying to study a specific formulation. She's like, "Oh man, my buddy, he gave his cat bong water and like just effed up his cat, man." And I'm like, and I was exposing my ignorance here, Nathan, but I didn't know what bong water was. I'm not in this world. I had to go back and Google it. And I'm like, and it was totally surreal because not 5 minutes before, I'm here speaking to these academics and just struggling to stay with it, right, on this like high level science. And the next minute, I'm talking to these potheads about giving cannabis to their animals and like having to juggle these conversations right in my mind. So it was like, I use that now as an example with the students of like, guys, like, these are the different types of audiences you'll be speaking with and like conversations you'll have to have.
Yeah, totally.
And you got to know who you're talking to, right? And tailor your conversation to the audience. But it was just surreal. And I'm like running back to the vet college to take blood samples from the dogs, and you're like, what just happened?
That's hilarious. Yeah. That's so funny too. It's that totally makes sense though. When you think about the way cannabis is looked at today, it totally makes sense that like just everybody's has some kind of interest in it.
It's really polarizing, and it's a little. I mean, it's like any pharmaceutical, really, but it is a bit frustrating. And I just hope people think you're kind of like on one side or the other. I'm like, no, I'm totally agnostic on this, right? I just want to develop some evidence. And if it turns out that what we're using it for, if it works and it's a good option, that's great, right? Yeah. That's awesome for veterinarians and for clients and for the animals. But let's hold our horses here a bit and let's not jump to any conclusions, because I think people jumped on board with the CBD stuff and they said, we're going to use it for this and we're going to use it for that. And everybody's like, oh, it works great. Yep. There's some evidence that like for arthritis in dogs, it might be working pretty well. There, some promising data out there. For epilepsy, for sure, looks fairly promising, particularly in maybe some of these cases that are tough to manage on traditional medications. But for a lot of it, I think it's going to be, at best, it'll be an add-on therapy, but in no way is it going to replace sort of traditional pharmaceuticals for a lot of the things, at least in veterinary medicine, that we're using it for. But I don't want to discount it either, that, for a certain subset of the animal population, CBD might be a really valuable medication to add in to another, medication regimen. But it's not going to be like the people that are thinking like this is going to cure everything. Yeah. And like, the people don't realize like how much this costs. Like the stuff that's good is not cheap. And for the pet owners that justifiably, right, as one got 3 cats and a dog myself, like I know this stuff's not cheap, any of the pharmaceuticals. The cannabis, the CBD, like the good products, they're at the doses that we're going to have to use to get some sort of effect. The cost is going to be substantially higher than the regular medications.
Yeah.
So if people are thinking this is going to be like a holistic alternative and it's going to be a lot more cost effective, it's not. But it still may have a role to play, and that's what we're trying to find out.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. No, that makes perfect sense. Is there excuse me, is there any research being done into the psychoactive component about it for treating like anxiety or like any like mental disorders?
That's a really good question, Nathan. Not that I'm aware of on the animal side. Well, we actually did a really small scale study. This was a really fun one. So we were doing a part of our safety work. Health Canada basically said, that's great, you want to do this work. We're going through all the hoops and getting everything checked off like we're supposed to. You need to do, before you can give this to clients for use in their animals, you got to use it in some experimental animals. So we have, our teaching dogs and teaching cats at the vet college. So we have this population that we can administer the medication. And then we watch them do all kinds of physical exams, neurological exams, take blood samples, and just make sure everything's okay with them. So that's what I was doing during the pandemic with our dogs and our cats. So we did these studies, and for the most part, everything was very, very safe. Now, there's maybe at higher doses some issues with some liver enzymes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is pretty well known, certainly on the human side too.
Oh, I didn't know that, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not every animal, and it's very difficult to make a sort of firm causality there, but it's definitely something that we would say for veterinarians, recommend if an owner is choosing to use these products is make sure they get their blood work done on their animal regularly, just to look out for these things, particularly because they have other issues going on, right? They're older animals, and they should be doing that monitoring anyway, but certainly if they're going to be using CBD long term. So we found that, but really it was really safe. Was the take-home message of this, as long as the doses were appropriate. But we didn't know that beforehand, so we had to do the study. That's why Health Canada asked us to do it. So we do it with the cats, and the staff that are working in the animal care unit had said, geez, these cats, they look... The word they used, the adjective, was chill. Okay, now they all knew we were doing cannabis research. It's like, wow, the cats are really chill. Like, sometimes when the cats are going to some of the labs with the students, just so that they're not like really fractious and excitable and things like that. Not that anything's invasive or painful, but just because, they're going to be in a different environment and maybe not have all their friends around, right? Like all the other cats in the animal care unit. They'll give them some medication to kind of calm them down. And veterinarians will give this to pet owners all the time, maybe before they come to the vet clinic or before they go somewhere stressful. So just, for your psychoactive component. Yeah, we have medications for that in vet med. Well, the staff had said, hey, why don't we use this CBD oil before the cats go to the labs? Because they look like they're really relaxed and they're really chill. And instead of using the medications they're already using. Yeah. That's really cool. That's a novel use for this. So it appears to be very, very safe. Let's try this. So we did a study, Nathan, where we tried to mimic what a pet owner would do with their cat, going to the vet clinic, and we dosed. So it was a crossover study. So we gave either the placebo, which was just olive oil, or because that's what this CBD oil is. It's basically an olive oil base, or the actual CBD oil. And so we did it 4 times. Twice the cat would get the CBD oil, and twice they would get the placebo. And then the experiment was, after a couple of hours, so they'd absorbed whatever cannabinoids, I put them in a carrier, and we took them outside, and we had a truck for our department that we would use, and the truck would drive around Campus Drive a couple of times to mimic going to a vet clinic. Yeah. Then the cat would come back in the carrier, and it would go to the lab, and one of the students would do a physical exam on the cat. And our behavior specialist would watch the cat and score the cat's behavior to see how scared they would be. Right. So, are they flipping out? Are they scratching at everything? Are they yowling? Are they pooping in the kennel? Like all that kind of stuff, right? Well, what it turned out was these cats, because they get handled so much, they really weren't scared by anything. So
Yeah,
even though they had
fair
never
enough.
been in the
Yeah.
vehicle, it didn't freak them out. They weren't crying or peeing in the kennel or anything while they were in the truck. So they never really got scared, and they didn't really get scared while we were doing the physical exam. So as an experiment, it really didn't prove a lot to us in terms of whether the CBD oil actually helped from like that, psychoactive. Did it make them chill or not? But I learned a valuable lesson on this one in that the placebo effect is super real. And we had one of the attendants in the animal care unit, and one of the cats was named Noon. And he's this big, fluffy, like 16-pound cat, a big guy,
God,
right? Like big and long haired, and he's just a big lazy cat. So I dosed all these cats like around lunchtime, and then they're waiting for their to go out in the vehicle. And there was Noon, and they have these cat towers in the animal care unit, right? Like, your standard like scratching post trees thing. So there's Noon, and he's flopped over upside down, paws stretched out, like he's just completely comatose.
Yeah.
And the animal care attendant was joking, but she's like, "Oh my God, you've killed Noon. Look at him. He's not moving at all." And I'm kind of like biting my tongue and go, "He was in the placebo group." But he's a cat, right? So you're talking about like psychoactive administration for, a sedative for a cat. They're cats. That's what they do, right? Like they're just lazy. So it was really hard to prove that the CBD is making them even lazier.
That's funny.
Yeah, it was. The dogs was a little bit different. The dogs, you could actually tell a little bit more if they were quieter.
Yeah.
And there's certainly, we think maybe the CBD will have a role for some of these dogs that are just really, really active, to kind of calm them down a bit. I'm not super optimistic, though, that it's going to have I think it may have a role to play in that, but we already have medications that are quite helpful for the dogs that need, that really are overactive.
Right,
and I don't think CBD is going to be as effective as those medications, but it might be a nice additional option to use for clients. Certainly, if you crank the dose high enough, you can see some effects. But the other thing that, it's a long-winded discussion to have on that. It's how much of it is the CBD. Almost all of these products have some level of THC.
That was my next question. Actually.
Yeah, and that's really where it gets into is like, well, how much THC is in it there? And yeah, you're calming these animals down a bit, but it's a really slippery slope before you get, okay, now they're intoxicated. So and now that's going to take a lot more work and specific products and specific types of cases, like the dogs that are truly really, really hyperactive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had a question with the cats as well, just because you said that they're all pretty used to everything and not really worried about anything. Could that also be because they are like cats that are already in the vet college all the time? Like they're kind of used to those environments?
Totally. Yeah. So, they're used to being, handled by students and examined. So you said, well, why would they even need to have a medication to calm them down a little bit? Well, it's when they start these exams, usually they don't get too stressed out. It's like any other cat. If you have them in a room for a couple of hours, they lose patience and they get kind of tired of it. But generally, we don't have issues when we use these animals, and they don't get used very much. So it's very, very rigorous in terms of like the schedule that they only get used maybe couple times every month for these labs. And so they certainly don't get overused, but they do get a lot of attention from people, which is why it's actually a pretty nice life for them, because they're always, during the day they're around people, they get lots and lots of attention, kind of wandering around. They have lots of companionship with the other cats. So yeah, it probably wasn't the best study design, in that if we wanted to see whether or not the CBD oil truly was sedating these cats. That's not the best word, sedating, but calming them, I guess, a little bit.
Sure.
We probably would have needed to pick something that was a little bit more stressful to actually determine that, because I guess I had thought driving them around in the truck was going to stress them out, and it didn't, and the physical exam didn't stress them out either.
Yeah, interesting. This is a little bit off topic, and I don't know if this is maybe it's an obvious question, but I didn't know that the animals weren't used that often, that there's only a couple times a month in their downtime, since they're already interacting with people all the time. Are students free to come in and interact with them, or are there like service animals?
Absolutely. So there's it's all very regimented, as you can imagine, and the sort of the animal care guidelines are extremely robust. But we definitely, for the students, it's very helpful for the animals that they get acclimated to the students, habituated, and just for socialization. So, for example, if people are on campus and they may see people walking like 4 beagles at a time. Well, that's those are the dogs, and they go out on the walks. But they do interact with people a lot. But we're very careful in terms of what those interactions are. So it's not like, oh, hey, well, we want to practice doing these specific techniques. Can we practice on the animals? No, you can't. Like, the students can't do those things. And I'm kind of dating myself here, but back in the day, a lot of that stuff, there was much less oversight. And so animals that were there be like, oh yeah, well, we can practice doing physical exams. You can practice these things. As a student, it was great, but we need to make sure that those animals don't get used too much. And there's some argument there about, okay, what's an appropriate amount of usage? And certainly for things that are not invasive, then you can do more of it. But just with the animals is that you stick them in a laboratory for 3 hours at a time. Even though it's nothing invasive, they just get tired of being there.
Yeah, they're over it.
And poked and prodded and whatever, and they just want to go to sleep, right?
Yeah.
So just making sure that they don't get overused by any stretch. But there's a ton of oversight on that. But the students do get to interact with them. We have times, for example, with the cats, where the cats that are newer to the animal care unit, they'll go up into the rest of the vet college, and then the students will go and hang out with them. And just so they get used to being picked up and petted and hang around people and just well socialized, but without any sort of medical aspect to it.
Yeah. Okay. Is there regiments or like rules for like what they're fed or the types of food? Or
No. So well, depend. Now, for some of the animals, they're actually there for our colleagues that were doing nutrition research. So they would be fed a specific diet, right? Because they were testing. One of the big things was a lot of the legume-based pet foods. So like pea-based pet foods, good source of protein, but there were potentially some issues with that. So they need to do some long-term studies, and that's what a lot of the animals, the beagles in particular, they were there for some of those studies. Otherwise, though, they have, we have our nutritionist at the vet college who has a sort of a balanced diet for them. The deal is just like with people, right? They're all individual animals, and you've got some skinny dogs and some fat dogs and some skinny cats and some fat cats. So we try to keep them as, healthy weight as we can. So they get and they have at least for the cats, they have their own feeders that are all automated. So they go in, and only that cat's collar can activate that feeder. So they get their own. They only get their own meal. But as for a teaching perspective, it's almost, I get it. Like, for the health of the animals, that's exactly what we should be doing. But for teaching the students, it would be helpful if they saw some fat cats. Because you know what? Like, that's what you're going to encounter, right, when you're in practice. And you got to know, okay, well, how are you going to assess this, right? How are you going to palpate them when they're like nothing but blobs of fat? Because that's what so many clients come in with with overweight animals. Underweight animals, right? Like, what does that look like? How do you determine that? But that's not, you can't justifiably have your animals in the teaching colony, right, be skinny or fat just because you want to show that to the students. So, we keep them as healthy a weight as we can, but it's totally a challenge because, like, they're animals. They're all individuals, and some of them get too fat. Other ones, you're like, wow, we need to start feeding them more because they get a standard diet, but everything needs to get adjusted. Yeah.
It's so interesting that when you look at multiple animals and see the different personality types or behaviors that they have, like my girlfriend's parents have this cat that is fat. It's very, very fat. And when its automatic feeder goes off, it bolts. It's like the only time you see it move that fast.
Oh, I got one like that too, Nathan. He's the same thing, and he actually came from the animal care unit. I adopted him out after we did the study because they only stay in the unit for a couple of years usually, and then they usually the vet students will end up adopting out these animals, and they were and they he was a big guy. Unfortunately, I got to admit this. he's been fatter since I've got him than he was at the animal care. But the same thing, right? When it's feed time, he's like right under your feet and he's darting in and out because they totally have their own personalities. Mm-hmm. And when you only have, one or two animals and maybe you don't see it, when there's 12 cats in the room and you totally see what they're like, and that's the boss cat, and that's the one that just wants to kind of curl up in a corner and doesn't want to interact. Yeah. And those two are buddies, and those two don't want to be together because they're gonna fight. Yeah, like totally like people.
That's so funny. I had buddies that told me that there's there's a superset of like general cat personalities. Is that true, or is that just wow, something people say?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly know they definitely have their own personalities. I don't know what the social structure is for with the cats, and I defer to our behaviorist that we have in our department,
right?
Who does a lot of this work. But it's I'm just a guy that I like my cats, right? And I like their personalities. I like seeing how the personalities. Sometimes they remain consistent, but other times like they totally change. Mm-hmm. As they get more acclimated and confident around people, and it just when you think you kind of have some understanding of it, it's like, oh my god, like I don't know a damn thing about them. Like why did they act this way now? Why did they do this? Right? Why does this cat get along with this other cat, but it hates that cat? Like this makes no sense.
Yeah, you just want to know. You're like, what is the reason too? Such persistent animals too. We have a cat, and well, my dad has a cat, and it's always coming down to the basement, or actually not as much anymore now that it's getting older. But when it was really young, it would sit at the door and just meow and scratch for so long. If nobody was upstairs, it wanted to get into the basement and see me, and it would just like you would try and like ignore it, especially if you're going to sleep. If it's like 9-10 p.m., but it'll just sit there and do that forever until you open the door.
Oh my god, yeah, and and some of them they'll do it. They'll scratch twice and then be like, okay, this isn't working. I'll go somewhere else. And other ones, it's like, I don't know. I think they know what they're doing, and they're just like, I'm just gonna piss you off. I'm just gonna keep doing it. You think you can ignore me?
Yeah.
No. So
it's the same thing with them pushing stuff off the tables.
Oh yeah.
It's so weird. Like they just walk up and just like slowly just like push glasses off and stuff.
It's hilarious. I know. It's like it's there. Like why is it there? Okay, I'm just gonna get rid of it now.
Yeah. I meant to ask too, is there a reason why it's beagles specifically? Is that widespread, or is it just the university?
So that's actually a good question. For a lot of the research work, they have purpose-bred beagles, and a bit of a long history on that. I mean, some practical considerations. They're a medium-sized breed, so they're generally they're not representative of a Great Dane or a Chihuahua, but they're kind of in between. For handling, it kind of makes sense. The temperament's usually pretty good at this stage. For a lot of the like lab bred beagles, I mean we sort of know a lot genetically about them, and they just work well as a representative of the dog species. But doing work with dogs is really interesting because you think of a lot of other species, you don't see that kind of variance that you do with dogs, and it's kind of crazy. Now, for like what I do as a pharmacologist, the good news is that there are certainly differences between certain breeds of dogs and how they handle drugs. Mostly due to some specific genetic differences. But generally, you give an antibiotic to a Great Dane and you give it to a Chihuahua, and you get the same kind of effect. Now, the dose, of course, is totally different. But it's not like one breed handles it totally different than another one does. But just in terms of doing, research on these animals or health problems, the issues that a Great Dane has, right? And you think of like musculoskeletal problems and potentially cardiovascular issues, but these really, really big animals with totally different physics as they're moving around,
right,
versus these little tiny animals where they have very different issues. And any pet owner who has small dogs, kind of understands, right? Like they often have real problems with their teeth, right?
Right. Yeah.
You had a dog. It was kind of evolved from wolves and like a bigger kind of dog, and it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, but still has the same number of teeth, right, in its mouth. And the teeth are smaller, but you're kind of cramming all this into a really different conformation. So the anatomic issues with some of the smaller dogs versus the larger dogs kind of dictates what types of medical problems they might be predisposed to, which is, I guess you could say the same thing about people. Somebody who's 6'6" and 350 pounds versus a child, right? I mean, yeah, they would have different medical issues too, but it's odd when you look at different species that in dogs you have you have a 5-pound patient and you have a 200-pound patient, and they're the same species and they're both adults, but one's just a really, really big dog and one's tiny, and the medical problems, there's some similarities there, but there's a lot of differences too.
Yeah, interesting. I meant to ask earlier, you were talking about pharmacokinetics. I don't mean to jump around too much, but it was a topic I'm a little bit interested in. But does that pharmacokinetics is the movement of chemicals through the body? Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, so it's the time course of the drug in the body. So essentially what it is, hey, you take whatever the drug is, whatever the medication is, you want to measure how much is in the body and where is it in the body and how fast is it being eliminated from the body. So we sort of say that it's 4 processes that are involved. There's absorption. So typically, right, with people and with animals too, most of the drugs are taken orally. So you got to get it out of your gastrointestinal tract and it's got to be absorbed into the bloodstream.
Is that what's called first pass? Or
so first pass is when it's going from the portal circulation. So all the blood vessels that drain the stomach, the small intestine, and then parts of the large intestine, that blood gets funneled into the liver. And that's the body's way of detoxifying lots of stuff. Right. So for around, you think, okay, you eat whatever, some sort of plant, some sort of herb, whatever it is, and there could be, whatever, toxins or things that are in it. Well, because that blood, after that stuff gets absorbed, it's going to the liver, which is, of course, the detoxifying organ in the body. Now the liver's got a crack at it and could kind of deal with it before it goes to the bloodstream and in the systemic circulation. So going back to the heart and then, everywhere in the body. So that's the first pass, is that the liver gets the first chance to detoxify. Okay. It also has an opportunity to take a lot of the nutrients, and it can kind of so for carbohydrates, simple sugars, fats, things like that, and it can sequester them, take it out of the circulation before it goes to the rest of the body. But in the pharmacology world, the first pass is, okay, liver has a chance to get rid of it, detoxify it, and then eliminate it in the bile, which sometimes is a really, really good thing. Other cases, when it's a drug you want to administer, that can make it a problem. Because you're like, oh, hey, we want to get a certain level of drug in the blood, but the liver is basically eliminating all of it before it ever gets a chance to get to the rest of the body. So then once it's in the bloodstream, you have this distribution. So it goes to different organs and different tissues, which sometimes can be a real challenge because if you have an infection at a certain site in the body and you want to get really high concentrations of an antibiotic there, well, how do you do that, right? How do you get that drug to that spot and maybe not cause toxicity in other parts of the body? Or, for drugs that are getting into really sensitive areas, like into the brain, or into some of the reproductive glands, where there's barriers between the blood and those tissues because they're pretty sensitive. But if you need the drug to get in there, how does it get there? Then at that point it gets metabolized, usually in the liver, but can be in some other tissues as well. And then excretion, which is just getting rid of it, which is usually in the bile or through the kidneys, and then out in the urine. So sounds pretty simple. But for any of the drug that we're administering in people or in animals, you don't want to give the drug unless you have some idea of what types of concentrations you're going to have and where is it going, how long is it staying in the body. So that would influence things too, how often do I take the drug? Do I take it every 8 hours? Do I take it once a day? Or do I just take it once and it's going to hang around for a week? So that's kind of what pharmacokinetics is in a nutshell. Getting a good sense of kind of how much drug is in the body, how long is it staying there. Pharmacodynamics is what is the drug doing? So how is it working? What is the mechanism? How is it killing the bacteria or the pathogen? Or what is it doing to the cells? And then you put the two of them together and it kind of gives you a sense of, the broader pharmacology.
Wow. That's so fascinating. I'm really interested in those topics. So why that route instead of, you mentioned you weren't as interested in surgery and you kind of like this a little bit more?
Well, because I sucked at anatomy is probably a little bit too glib of an explanation, but No, it was. I just found it fascinating because I always liked physiology. I just like learning how the body worked, right? Like how is it doing this? How is a transmission down a nerve, so an action potential, this electrical signal jumping down a neuron and then stimulating a muscle cell to contract? Like, that's really cool. How is that happening? Wait a minute. We give some lidocaine, right? A local anesthetic, and you go to a dentist and they give you a block, right? Oh, wait a minute. It's blocking the sodium channels, and now there was the sodium ion that was responsible for this electrical signal, right? Like, it's a really basic example, but of how some of these medications actually work on cells in the body or on pathogens and doing their job. So I look at pharmacology as like, it's just applied physiology. It's just basically, the surgeon is going in there and fixing the anatomy, in sort of a physical sense, while pharmacology is sort of trying to fix the physiology, but doing it typically through a chemical means.
Right. Oh. And yeah. Can I get you some more coffee?
No, I'm good. You're good. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to pour myself a little bit more. And you also mentioned too that you were looking at like when you were in school at different areas like you mentioned physiotherapy.
Yeah.
Did you? And I'm sorry if I missed this, but what put you on the veterinary path instead of?
Yeah, good question on that one. I mean, and to be fair, it's like most people, right? You don't say, "Oh, this is the only career I could possibly do in my life," and everything else is, not for me. And I think I would have been, quite interested in a lot of different areas too, with physiotherapy and just generally, how the body moves and trying to, again, fix some of these issues when they came up. I just thought it was sort of appealing. Ironically, with our project now, we're actually doing, it's not physiotherapy per se with some of the studies we're doing, but there is a lot of rehabilitation techniques and assessments that we're using to assess whether the cannabinoids are effective. Are they doing anything in terms of speeding up recovery after surgery? So I guess I did kind of get a little bit involved that way, but nothing like our rehabilitation specialists in the vet college who are phenomenal at what they do. So, it was one of those where I kind of started down on the veterinary road, but getting those experiences with veterinarians that, I think I'd be interested in this. I think I'd like it. But it's the same thing too. Every time I go to the optometrist and I'm like, I thought of doing optometry. I'm like, it seems kind of neat. What is like, wow, some of the cool technology they have when they're assessing your eye and the diagnostics. I'm like, wow, that seems pretty cool too. You kind of get, well, maybe I could have done that. Nah, I'm happy where I'm at. Yeah. But there were lots of careers I think that would have been pretty interesting.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think like most people, it's just I guess maybe not most people, but you seem like the type of person that just anything and like just biologically has just always been fascinating to you. So just anything.
Yeah, and I didn't realize this, Nathan, until I got older, and it was like, man, like there's sort of a level of curiosity about things, and I don't understand. I got to accept, other people maybe don't. They're just not curious about things. Like it's just not interesting to them. And for me, it's like, well, I kind of want to know, like, well, why is that? And a lot of it's not necessarily like biological things, but even just like, mathematical, like what are the relationships between different things? And like, how is this, what is the odds of this happening if this event occurs, or, human behavior and like, interactions between things, but just like, what are those relationships? And you're curious about what those relationships are. Can you quantify them? What other factors are involved? And I kind of focus on like a biological sort of model with the drug aspect of it. But I realized like, it's all kinds of things like, oh, why is this the way it is? Right. Example, we were talking about the traffic. Like, well, why is it that when that person slows down in front, right? And it causes that chain reaction. Why is it the person that's 10 cars down the line that ends up paying the price for that? Right. Yeah. Like, how does that happen? Right. And, I just realized, some people seem to ask a lot of those questions and are kind of fascinated by that. And others just, like it is what it is. And it doesn't seem to faze them. But I'm in the former camp. Yeah. I've kind of realized.
I think I've had a pretty similar experience, just trying to understand that, especially people like pretty close to me that I'm just like, just got to remember sometimes that they're not they don't want the same answers I want. Like I just want to know this so badly.
Well, so going back to the beginning when we talked about some of the teaching stuff, and I it was one of the things I had to realize with students, and I'm lucky with the vet students that they're awesome students, but they don't all have the same intellectual curiosity, I may say. They just kind of want to know what the answer is, how they're going to use this to solve whatever their problem is, but the kind of underlying rationale or mechanisms behind it, that's maybe not of interest. And you have to realize like not everybody has that same mindset that I do. I also realize like I'm a really quantitative person, right? I've always been comfortable with numbers, and I like quantifying things and seeing those relationships mathematically. And I'm not like some super math whiz or anything like that, but I like to see how those things work together. And I realize other people maybe don't see things that way. So when I started teaching, and I'd have lots of graphs and I'd have equations, and I would think, oh, it's pretty obvious, right? Like, okay, they're directly proportional. If this one variable increases, this one is also going to increase in a linear fashion. And I was like, well, for some students that is totally not intuitive in that type of explanation. And maybe like a graphical representation or a narrative representation, like a story or something, might be better able to express that concept. And you kind of realize, like, wait a minute, okay, I sort of think this way, but other people don't. So how can I get that idea across to them in a different manner?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. Just this idea that I love looking at this in people is like some people, just like you said, something is so intuitive. They just see it and they can understand how it works. And for some people that's pharmacology or mathematics or some things. And then other people it's sports. It's the way their body moves. They just know exactly where their body is in space. And some people are neither of those, but it's so interesting to see what's intuitive for one person and what's not.
Oh, totally. And and I guess my challenge as an instructor is, right, okay, what are the techniques that really will help the students maybe not necessarily like master everything, because it was like me with anatomy and surgery, right? Like, yeah, I could do it. I could spay the dog and neuter the cats and do these things, and it wasn't, I did a fine job of them, but I was not super skilled, right? Whereas people who are naturally intrinsically talented at doing that, you just saw their technique, right? The way they handled the instruments, the way they handled the tissues, their speed and their precision in which they were doing it. I mean, it required a lot more focus for me to do these things, right, and a lot more thought. I did the job reasonably well, but it was definitely like, okay, it's like saying, yeah, I can hit a golf ball off the tee, but I ain't going on the PGA Tour, right? I mean, like there's just that kind of natural talent there. But the flip side is like, when I'm teaching some of the students, like, well, this may not come intrinsically to you, but there are still some concepts here that you got to know, right? This is important. Like there are some things you may not be comfortable with math, but you got to be able to calculate dosages. You got to understand, fluid rates and fluid calculations. And so you may not be super comfortable with it now, but we're going to give you the practice you need so that hopefully you're comfortable enough. Yeah. Now, it may not be something you're like, wow, I want to devote my life to doing this, but you got to be good enough to at least be able to use it. So there's a bit of a challenge there. But yeah, it was an eye-opener when you kind of realize, like, wow, like, yeah, students don't learn the way I learned, right? They don't see it the way I saw it. So, okay, how do I change this up so that they can see it? Yeah.
Well, I think that's there's a dichotomy, I think, sometimes in people, anybody that's like educating somebody else is maybe not a dichotomy, because I don't think people fall into either camp. It's maybe more of a spectrum, but everybody's had a teacher who assumes everybody knows exactly what they're trying to teach them. It's like, no, that's why you're my teachers, because I don't know. But then there's the other side where there's also people that assume, educators that assume that their students know absolutely nothing of what they're talking. But it's interesting to see where students do the best falling in between that. So.
Oh, totally. And you know what? And what's interesting, you talk about like in a class setting with 30, 50, 100 students, right? The spectrum that's there, and it's daunting when you get into a class and okay, there are some students that know nothing about this area, and I got to start from square one, right, and teach these basics. And there are other students who, quite frankly, probably know some of this better than I do from whatever experiences they've had before. And you're like, and I've got to find a way to try and reconcile that and to reach all of them. And, it's not going to be perfect for anybody, but to give everyone something, right? That they can take out of that and go, okay, yeah, that was useful. That wasn't useful, but a lot of that was. But how do you kind of reach across that spectrum? Because it can be a challenge, and it's a bit of an eye opener when I always get a kick out of it when you see these people that new professors or old professors or whatever. People go to teach and they say, okay, I'm in front of the class, so I'm the expert on this. And you're like, man, you don't know shit, right?
Yeah.
Like, and the students know, and you've been a student, right? You know right away, right? When the instructor's like, no, they don't really know what they're talking about. Or somebody asks them a question and they BS some answer, right? And the students are like rolling their eyes and they know that, like, that's not right, right? They're just coming up with something. And I learned pretty quick. It's like, man, people ask me a question. I don't know. Man, I don't know. I'll look it up. I'll try and find it for you. Cause like, but that's an awesome question. I never thought of it that way, but like, I don't know those things, but I'm, not going to insult your intelligence by lying about something.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And yet you see this with some of these instructors, like, oh, I have to know everything. I have to like show my intellectual superiority. And it's like, I've been like humbled by animal science students that ask me questions that like, I had no idea what in the world, was going on, that were phenomenal questions. And like, yeah, it can be a challenge. Yeah,
I bet. Well, and I think it's interesting too, because sometimes people get locked into this idea, like you said, like I have to know everything, and they forget sometimes that you're not only you're teaching, but teaching is a good way to also be learning at the same time. And then also a lot of the best learning comes from those conversations where you're having a conversation with a student that you both only kind of know, and you're both trying to figure it out. That's a really cool time too.
For sure. And the other thing too, I mean, you talk about setting an example for the students, and I mean, one of the examples that I want to set is that nobody knows everything, but it's what do you do about it, right? And how do you proceed? And for a lot of the questions that I'll get asked, I'm a very evidence-based. That's how the prism through which I teach pharmacology is evidence-based veterinary medicine. But a lot of times we don't have the evidence. Like, we don't know. Or to go back to the example, your question about like glucosamine. Well, there's quite a bit of evidence, but it's not very clean, right? There's no definitive answer one way or the other. So it's a messy kind of scenario. But that's what you want the students to realize, is that life is messy, right? And these answers are not going to be clear cut, and you can't distill it into a 10-second soundbite. And so they say, well, like, you're trying to have the conversation with them. We don't always have good evidence. It's not going to be a yes or no, black or white dichotomy. So you gotta wade through that. But it's that process, right? Like you said, that conversation with the student. And when some of the students, they don't want to hear that. They just give me the answer, and it's like, well, you know what? Over time and more experience, they realize, wait, that's not the way it is. And kind of learn to appreciate that nuance and that gray zone. Yeah.
Well, from talking to you for a while, it seems like you would probably do a good job at that too, because just the way you're speaking about it. And it's tough when you ask somebody a question and they're like, what did you say earlier about I can't remember, but it's just the example of like, you ask somebody something and then they say, no, it can't be that way because we don't it's never been that way. Or you said when somebody asks you a question, you're like, I've never thought about it from that angle before, instead of just dismissing it and being like, well, it can't be that way because maybe we have like 10 years of literature on this subject and nobody's ever thought of that question. It's like, that doesn't mean a new question can't be a good one. So still investigating it instead of just being dismissive about it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it is frustrating for the students in that they, you keep hearing this like, well, we don't know. And you get that a lot. And they're like, well, what do we know? Well, we know a lot. We know a ton, but it's just, you're looking at it from a slightly different angle. And it's like, well, we don't know what it's like from that angle. But that's where I'm hoping, to kind of stimulate some of that intellectual curiosity in the students. And for some of them, that's kind of, it's not the road they want to go down, and that's totally fine. But for those that do, hopefully, they kind of come out of that and go, yeah, that was kind of neat. I'm never going to use that drug in the type of practice that I'll do, but that was a kind of an interesting lesson on, what this does or how this works, or how it interacts with something else. And if they're thinking about it from different angles, then forcing me to think of it from different angles, I think everybody gets something out of that conversation.
Yeah, no, totally. Is there an area or like a subject that's kind of the most difficult to get out of, like where it's just like nobody really wants to talk about it or look at it? Or...
Well, interesting though, Nathan. Some of the difficult stuff is I find to be some of the most rewarding to teach. The drug stuff is a little bit different because the drug stuff, it kind of falls into, well, am I going to use this drug or not based on what type of species does the student see themselves practicing. So it's, for example, if they think they're going to be a small animal veterinarian, and I'm talking about drugs that you're only going to be using, say, in livestock. Why do I care? I'm never going to use this drug. Well, no, you're not going to use that drug, but there might be similarities to things that you will use. So it's still worth having that conversation. And I think just as a well-rounded veterinarian, they should be aware of some of these things. But to go back to your question for the things that they don't want to, like, nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to learn about, I spent a lot of time teaching physiology and teaching different body systems. And my favorite body system to teach was one that nobody wanted to do, which was renal physiology, so the kidneys.
Oh, that's interesting. That
Yeah,
nobody would want to be...
the kidneys are tough. They're tough to understand what's going on, and there's all kinds of mechanisms. There's all these different regions within the kidney, and they have different cellular mechanisms, and it's complicated. And you have things happening like in multiple processes happening at the same time. So what's happening early on in the kidney versus what's happening at the end of the line of what's called the nephron, the functional unit of the kidney. But it's so applicable. And I'm just like a total like real life practical example kind of person. I'm like, well, come on guys, we all pee every day. Everybody pees all the time, right? Everybody, like, you need to detoxify your blood. And the kidneys are doing all this stuff. Like, aren't you interested in this? And I realized, like, when I started teaching, then it was like, wow, this is so complicated, and how am I going to like get students to appreciate what's going on with this? And I'll never forget, it was the first year I was teaching. It was a kid. I shouldn't say a kid. He was like the same age as me because I was young. I was like 28 when I started this, and he was an older student in animal science. He was probably maybe only a year or two younger than me. And this guy he was a real nice guy. You know, we'd chat in labs and stuff, but he was not a great student and was not super interested in, science, but he had to take the course.
Okay.
It was a nice
like
guy.
An elective or?
No, it was a core course for the animal science curriculum. They all had to take physiology.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
So, he was muddling through, but wasn't passionate about the material. Right? And I try and, engage the class and get them to get excited about this. And he's just, a lot of times he's got his head on the desk and he's sleeping or whatever, just not paying attention. I'm like, all right, well, but to each their own. Yeah. And then one day we get to the section with the kidneys. And we're talking about osmoregulation and fluid balance and, water reabsorption from the kidneys. I'm like, well, why is it that some days you produce a whole bunch of really dilute urine and other days it's like steam coming out, right? Yeah, like, you're all dehydrated and stuff. Like, how is the kidney doing this? What's happening? And so we get to the example, which I think for any university student is very apropos. And we talked about the influence of alcohol on your kidneys, right? And like, well, why is it that when you drink alcohol and you have to pee more? And we're looking at the physiological mechanism of this. So a hormone called antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, and when it gets released and what does it do at the kidneys and how does it allow the kidney to reabsorb water from the urine.
Okay.
So it comes basically, it's going to be urine, but then the body gets it back. The kidney sucks it back and it goes back into the bloodstream. So that's the role of this hormone, is to basically try and reabsorb as much water as possible out of the kidney. And it's got some weird mechanisms that it does it. It opens up some water channels and all that kind of, that part of it's not particularly exciting. But this student, his ears perked up as soon as we're talking about, like, you go to the bar and you have a couple drinks and you have to start to pee more. And he's like, so he raised his hand and he started asking some questions about this. I'm like, it's kind of how it's working. He's like, well, hold on. Could we do an experiment? And I'll never forget this. He's like, could we do an experiment? Like, what if we went to the Long Branch? Because these are all ag students, right? And this was back, like 15 years ago. When we went to the Long Branch, we had like a group of students that drank like this alcohol, and then we went and we measured their urine output, and we have these other students and they had a placebo and it didn't have the alcohol, and we measured their urine, and he was just, you could see the hamster spinning the wheel in his brain. That's right. Awesome. And I've been trying for like 6 months to get this student engaged in physiology and neural physiology, nothing. Hematology, cardiovascular physiology, digestive physiology, just didn't really care. Got to the kidneys. Probably the most conceptually difficult, technically complicated region that I taught anyway. And I thought, this is going to be a disaster. And yet that was the thing that I got this particular student, just got him excited about this. And I had to simmer down. This has all been studied before. Yeah. I don't think we're going to be,
We're not making any breakthroughs.
No breakthroughs on this. But I really like the fact that you're thinking about scientific design, to figure this out. And that's when I realized, wait a minute, okay, just because it's a hard subject, there are things about every subject that will make it accessible or more accessible. And how do you do that? And they also realized too that for every student, there's something that will get them going. I don't know what it is. I remember when I was a student, I didn't always know what it was either, but there's things that will pique their interest, and I might think it's stupid. And I think they're really gimmicky in some of my lectures. I think, we talk about these weird esoteric things, and honestly, I'm kind of embarrassed when I do it in class. But I think, so the students come up to me and say, oh yeah, no, I really liked when you did this example of whatever. And I'm like, okay, if you like that, I mean, you guys are the one that we're here for you. So I do it. But yeah, everybody's a little bit different on how they conceptualize some of these things. But yeah, that was one of the areas that I still do. I don't get to teach the kidneys anymore, which is too bad, because it's super important. And it's not as complicated as we need to make it sometimes. I'll never remember that first year that animal science student where he's literally had his head on the desk, and then all of a sudden is asking all these questions about an experiment at the long branch.
That's so funny where people's minds go to. Why don't you get to teach about kidneys anymore? It's
just because there's I have to teach the pharmacology course. So when I started, it was mostly teaching the undergraduate program in physiology. In the vet college, we teach students from other colleges as well, primarily from agriculture. So we taught a course for animal science students about physiology, which was very similar to the physiology course we teach the veterinary students, just a little bit scaled down, because we don't have quite as much time, not quite as much depth, but it's still a very, very rigorous course. So I did that for about 10 years and loved doing it, and then taught physiology to the veterinary students as well. A bunch of other courses, bits and pieces too. But the last 5-6 years been primarily teaching pharmacology.
Right.
And that's a bit of a thing. I am a veterinary pharmacologist. That's kind of in my wheelhouse. It's what I should be teaching. There's other folks who are totally capable and do a wonderful job teaching physiology, so they can do that, but maybe they wouldn't be as comfortable teaching pharmacology. So right. No. It's just kind of divvying up the resources.
Yeah. And so it sounded like people don't want to really learn about the kidneys because they're complicated.
It's complicated and it's mysterious, and it's just the way historically I think it's been taught has not been something that is easy to conceptualize, which I think is, versus with the heart, and everybody can kind of visualize the heart pumping and blood being ejected and going to the rest of the body, or, a muscle contracting, or, things like that. Whereas the kidney, it's kind of this mystery of blood comes in and blood comes out, and then urine comes out somewhere else. And it's but yeah, it's so essential to everything that happens on a normal basis, but then also when there's disease conditions and how it impacts the kidney. And then from the drug angle, for me, the big part of it is drugs are responsible for eliminating the kidneys are responsible for eliminating a lot of the drugs in the urine. So we need to know how it works that way. And then for some rare drugs that cause kidney damage, you need to know how the kidney works. And so what is the drug doing to cause that damage?
It's funny. It's not an organ that people think about very often, but there's obviously 100% essential to your body.
Oh my God!
It's one of those ones where you don't want to mess that one up.
Yeah, for me, it's the liver and the kidney, because they're the two primary organs involved in drug metabolism and excretion, and they're the ones that nobody ever thinks about until stuff goes bad, right? and then it's oh man. But the other thing too is if your muscle aches, or you have neural dysfunction or something, or your heart rate goes really fast, you might tell pretty quickly. Whereas if your kidneys aren't working so well, or your liver's not working so well, you don't always notice it right away, which is why I think we medically, there can be some pretty significant problems before the person or the animal kind of find out and start getting clinical signs of that.
Yeah. Well, do you have an area that is your favorite to teach, and specifically in the pharmacology area? Like, is there a niche that you just like can't wait to talk about?
Well, there's quite a few. Usually not so much a niche, like, because the way we talk about some of the drugs is in like groups. So, for example, like we're talking about like with the cannabis thing, we might talk about like analgesic drugs in a group, or we'll talk about drugs used for behavioral issues in animals as a group. I like talking about in sort of general pharmacology, how the body's dealing with the drug, what it's doing with that. We have some other excellent instructors who talk about that too. So I just kind of touch on it a bit here and there in some of the other lectures that I do. I really like dealing with antimicrobials, antibiotics, particularly because of antibiotic resistance and the challenges and the issues facing with that. So how do we use these drugs as efficiently as possible to kind of maximize effectiveness, but also minimize resistance? And that is that's the big issue in all of medicine. How we do that. And so there's so much to unpack there with the students, and so many of those drugs get used in veterinary medicine. So there's a lot of discussion that goes on in those areas, but every one of the topics that I discussed, there's all kinds of cool things that you're going to be doing, with those drugs and conditions that you're going to be treating with it. So they're always kind of neat. The other thing I really like for pharmacology is that it dovetails with basically every other subject we teach in the veterinary program. The physiology that I learned in first year, all the infectious diseases they're learning concurrently while I'm teaching my course, the pathology that they're, when the animal dead, how does it, when they cut them up and look under the microscope or see the lesions, how could the drugs have influenced what was going on there? The diagnostics, and of course the medicine that they'll learn in the next year. So it really relates to everything else in their program.
Wow. And are you still on that topic? Are you still doing research or looking into the areas of like you mentioned just some of those residues staying in food animals? Yeah,
so I do a little bit on that. I'm not doing any active research on that, but I do some work internationally with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So they brought me in when I was working for Health Canada, and so we do. It's kind of an arcane process, but basically it's the same idea of assessing these residues. But I don't do any of those studies myself. It's not that I wouldn't do them anymore. It's just that my research has kind of gone in other areas. But we kind of look at the data and then make recommendations for, residue limits for international trade. And it's kind of a weird, very esoteric, specialized area. But it's kind of neat when you get into it and you start to know, and you develop some relationships with the people who are in this similar area. But we're not doing a whole bunch of active research on that. Some of my colleagues at the university have been doing that from time to time. Most of the stuff I've been doing for research has been the cannabis related work, and then hopefully we'll be diving back into some of the antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. Again, we've got colleagues, not just in the vet college in Saskatoon, but of course all across Canada and worldwide, priority area. But I think there's still a role for some of the things that we can offer here in those fields. And then other graduate students have different projects related typically to drugs or toxins. And then maybe I can participate a little bit here or there, but it's not my project per se.
I see. With antibiotics, it's like, and you mentioned that the resistance is an important topic in all of medicine. Is it like people are like really, really concerned about that? It seems like in the last little while, and just about antibiotics in their food, resistance in humans. And is it, I know obviously it's important, but is it like people get really freaked out about it, and is that warranted, or should they be a little bit?
Well, I think so. There's a whole ton of issues there that need to be unpacked. In terms of antimicrobial resistance in general, yeah, it's a massive issue. And I mean, before COVID and infectious diseases, I would have put antimicrobial resistance as one of the top public health issues. And I think most public health agencies probably would have agreed with that. Maybe not number one, but would have been right up there. And particularly the classic antibiotic resistant superbugs. You get an infection with this particular bacteria and you can't treat it. And 50 years ago, it would have been pretty simple to treat, but now that pathogen is resistant to all kinds of different antibiotics, and there's really nothing good that we can use. And it's a really, really scary thought, and something that, like, wait a minute, we got to be careful with this. By the flip side, though, it's not like you can stop using antibiotics, because you've got an infection, whether it's a urinary tract infection, respiratory infection, skin infection, whatever it is. It's like, no, it needs to be treated too, but how can we treat it smarter, right? So which drugs are we using? How long are we using them for? What dose are we using them for? How are we delivering them? Where are they going? All those types of things that can lead into antibiotic resistance. It's a super challenging area of research, though, in that it's so broad, and it goes right to like the molecular level, the cellular level with the pathogen, but all the way to like epidemiology and entire ecosystems, right? And if you have these drugs in the groundwater, what is that doing to the resistance genes being transferred in the bacteria? From veterinary medicine, there were certainly, none of this came as like sort of new to me. We'd been talking about this when I was a student back, 20, 25 years ago, in vet med, and it had been an issue before that. So our graduates, I'm really proud to say, they are very well versed and very attuned to antibiotic resistance. And you won't see veterinarians graduating from our school who are prescribing antibiotics willy-nilly. They kind of know what they're doing in that regard. The problem is that, again, you still got to use these drugs. And any use of antibiotics will inevitably lead to selective pressure for resistance. Does that mean that, you are going to get a pathogen that is antimicrobial resistant because you gave your dog amoxicillin? No, right? And drawing those causal links is exceptionally difficult and complicated. But is there a way that maybe we can dose your dog better, more effectively, maybe to try and minimize antimicrobial resistance on a broader scale? But kind of a smoking gun, this animal leading to this resistant bug in a person or another animal, that's really hard to kind of link that.
Yeah, people like to, that's an interesting one. People like to do that a lot, is like just repeat something they heard and they said this caused this. And it's like, well, not necessarily. With treating like the resistance, is there like a go-to technique that is being studied on how to kind of counter this, or is it just like
it's not a new drug? And that's the thing, is that and this is in the human med, like in vet med, we're typically like 10 to 20 years behind what the human medicine world is doing in some regards. Other areas actually were ahead of human medicine, and that with some species differences and some disease conditions that we deal with in vet med that maybe humans don't deal with as much, we might be a little bit ahead of the curve. But in terms of drug therapy, the antibiotics that come on that are approved for veterinary use are typically those that have been either no longer used in human medicine or are very old drugs in human medicine. But even in human medicine, they stopped making new antibiotics years ago. And this is one where it's kind of a scary thought, but it is pretty rational. From a drug company perspective, nobody, if somebody does come up with a new wonder antibiotic, you want to safeguard it as much as you can, because the more you use it, the faster resistance will develop. Right. So of course you only want to use it when you absolutely have to use it, but that means you're not using it very much. And that means it's, for the drug company, they don't have a real incentive to try and develop a bunch of new antibiotics. And the regulatory agencies have tried to, develop some incentives for them, and that's a whole another conversation. But long story short, there's not a bunch of new miracle antibiotics coming down the pipeline. So what we need to do is use the drugs that we do have, use them more efficiently. And unfortunately, that sounds pretty simple, but it's like, well, what does that mean to actually use them more efficiently? Does it mean do you dose them for longer, or do you dose them for shorter? I remember as a kid seeing all the signs, finish your bottle of antibiotics, right? Yeah. Finish your vial. Like, don't ever, oh, your symptoms go away, don't stop using the pills. You got to finish your vial because it's going to promote antibiotic resistance. To be honest, that may not have been the best message, in that for some of the medications that, that made sense in the context of, just because your symptom goes away doesn't mean the infection is cleared up, and maybe you still need to keep using the antibiotic. But for some conditions where they were being prescribed for a longer duration than really they should have been, using antibiotics just in case is actually a really terrible idea in terms of antibiotic resistance. But that's a really tough message to get across. It's really nuanced, and there's so many uncertainties that are there. So what do we do about it? As veterinarians, there are some things that, okay, we know are just bad ideas, right? Certain broad spectrum drugs that are active against a whole bunch of different pathogens, well, you don't use those unless you need to use those, right? Doing some diagnostics to give us a good sense of, okay, what is it you're actually treating? Is it this type of pathogen or is it that type of pathogen? Because that will influence what drug we're going to select.
Right.
So having those diagnostics, trying to get the client to be on board with that, to do those culture susceptibility testing, that can be really helpful. Maybe it's as simple as doing something like topical administration of a drug versus oral administration or injectable product. And then, as a pharmacologist, I'm always about the drugs, but I got to admit on these issues, things like vaccination. That's, if you never actually got infected with the pathogen because you were vaccinated, you don't need to treat it with an antibiotic. Husbandry, nutrition, all of these other factors where, wait a minute, those animals were only getting sick because they were overcrowded or because their nutrition wasn't very good and they were weak. Are there some factors that we can fix up that eliminate the need to give them antibiotics, period?
Be more preventative instead of...
Totally preventative. So, long term, there's definitely and we've made big strides in a variety of animal industries in those regards. There's still a long way to go. I was just at the doctor's office a few weeks ago, and I took a picture of all the signs they had about the antibiotic resistance, because I asked the MD at the time, like, do you guys still get these questions from clients about, I got a flu, but I want some antibiotics? And like, all the time. All the time I get these. So they've got, the informational brochures and posters and things of, okay, you got a runny nose or you got a sore throat. The odds of it being a bacterial infection are really low. We're not going to prescribe you antibiotics unless we had some diagnostic information to back that up,
right?
To say, it is a thing. So there's so many different avenues that they're all really important pieces of the puzzle when it comes to antibiotic resistance, but it's not a simple answer that's just going to fix it, make it go away.
Is there, how does that look in the, in the agricultural world, if you might know, because I think people, I don't know anything about it, but you hear all the time people are worried about well, my food's got antibiotics in it, and they're doing this and that, and are they? I would imagine that cows, for example, are not just being given antibiotics just cause. It's probably only when it would be only when it's necessary.
Well, so there's a debate there, and historically, I think there was a lot more use that really wasn't justifiable. And animal agriculture industries have been really on the forefront of changing some of their practices so that they're not using things unless they really are justifiable. Now, there is a bit of a gray zone there. What somebody says, no, I don't think using that particular drug is warranted. But the big one was everybody would say, well, they're just giving antibiotics because they make the animals grow faster or improve their feed conversion. So you don't need to feed them as much so they gain the same amount of weight.
Right.
Well, those types of uses have been removed from veterinary medicine, certainly since that was one of my boss at Health Canada. That was her primary job for over 10 years, was getting that type of drug use changed from antibiotics. So just using antibiotics for growth promotion purposes. Is it making a difference? I think it is in terms of the amount of use, but it's not easy to draw a straight line between that and then antibiotic resistance. And decreasing antibiotic resistance in, the overall microbiome all over the place. The other thing, and this is something that because the work that I do with drug residues is people conflate that with antibiotic resistance and issues in food animals all the time. And it is a little bit esoteric, but there is an important distinction there about like if there's tiny amounts of a drug in the tissue, and when I say tiny, I mean, I'll give an example on this. Some of the drugs that we use in animals, same drugs are used in people. And the amount of residue that would be in animal tissue, if you sat down and ate, say, a meal of chicken or fish or beef or milk or whatever it is, and you talk, well, how much drug is in there? It would be in the order of magnitude of like 1/1000th, 1/10,000th of a human dose. Okay, so but it's something, again, people don't understand like what these units are. We talk about like nanograms of a drug or micrograms of a drug. They go, oh my God, look, there's 50 micrograms of drug there. I go, yeah, but you realize your dose is 50 milligrams of that drug. So 50 micrograms of drug is 1/1000th of what your dose you're taking. Now, in some cases, that might still be too much. Maybe there should be 0, right? Maybe that drug is unsafe. If that's the case, that drug doesn't get approved for use in food animals. In other cases, it's completely and totally safe, and we have real world evidence to back it up. It's been used in animals for decades and decades, and there are no ill effects of that. So there's a whole sort of science behind that, and it's what it boils down to is risk assessments. Say, okay, where maybe the problem is occurring, and then at what levels would those problems occur? And my message when I speak to the general public about this is that it's super conservative, meaning like we're really, really safe about when we're setting these kind of limits or these drug usage in animals in terms of what is allowed.
Right.
Anything that even remotely looks like it's going to be a problem doesn't get approved for use in food animals anyway. Pet animals is a different story, right? Because there's all kinds of things there. But for food animals, like the drug residues themselves are not an issue. Antibiotic resistance, though, is not the same thing. Yeah. Because you could treat a cow, and have absolutely 0 residues in her muscle or in her milk or anything, but have caused some pretty big changes to the bacteria that she houses and cause increase in resistance in those bacteria. And some of those pathogens maybe get into the broader environment, or they contaminate the food or whatever it is. Well, it's not a residue of the drug, but it's still an after effect of the antimicrobial use. And I think for a lot of the stuff that people kind of look at the residues, because it's quantifiable, it's easy to pinpoint, whereas antibiotic resistance is not. And it's really challenging to kind of wrap your head around that. But in my mind, that's where the public health challenge is. We've been using drugs in food animals, in worldwide for 80, 90, almost a century in some cases, right? Like, and there's no justifiable argument that it causes human health concerns if we're doing it appropriately. And I think it's pretty safe to say that pretty much all the countries with a robust regulatory regime are doing it appropriately. But antibiotic resistance is one where I think there certainly were some justifiable arguments that things needed to change. Some changes certainly have been made. Every industry is a little bit different. Poultry is different than swine, different than fish farming, different than dairy. But every industry has been making improvements. I think there's still some ways to go in some of this. Some of my colleagues at the vet college are doing some wonderful work on like rapid diagnostics and looking at the genetic markers for antibiotic resistance, which makes my head spin when they try to talk about it. Like, wow, I just give them the drugs, right? Like I just use the drugs, right? Like what they're doing is amazing. But yeah, there still is in my mind, for public health, that's antibiotic resistance is where it's at. It's not about the drug residues. It's about antibiotic resistance, but that's not as easy to, you can't just say like, oh yeah, this sample had this number of X parts per million of a drug. And there's definitely progress made there, but it's going to be a long slog.
No, that makes It's good to hear. That's really informative, and yeah, that's about what I thought, but I wanted some confirmation.
Well, when people say like, oh, in this, should I buy? And I'm not going to get into all like organics and all that kind of stuff, and everybody's kind of got their opinion and things like that. But when it comes to like drug residues, you can say like, look, I will bang the table on this one that this is not a concern for people, and if it was a concern with millions of people consuming meat and milk and animal derived food products every day for years and years over a lifetime, if there were concerns, we'd find them.
Yeah.
Right. We'd know, like, if there was a practical problem here, we would see it. And I think veterinarians by and large are doing a really, really good job with how they use these drugs in food animals, because they know that it doesn't even have to be a real problem. If there's a perception of a problem, it has a massive impact on the industry. So yeah, that's not where I would be losing any sleep.
Well, good. It's good to hear. It's actually a little bit past 2:45, so
Oh my God. Okay,
I should get you out of here.
Yeah.
So, thank you for being here. That was great. It was really informative, and I had a great time listening to you. So
awesome. Well, thanks very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.